Big tech stocks under pressure, a bit mixed this morning after getting a big boost from the Trump administration's temporary tariff reprieve for tech products. That sent Apple back above a $3 trillion market cap on Monday. Joining us now with more, Dan Ives, Wedbush Securities Global Head of Technology Research. Dan, great to have you back with us. The last time we spoke, you said these tariffs were causing an economic Armageddon that would set U.S. tech back many years, and now we've got Apple hitting above $3 trillion. Where do you sit with your outlook on tech today, given these negotiations?
Yeah, now is a dark day. I mean, like when me and you and Julie were talking, and I think we're in a better situation today than we were then, because these tariffs, it gives a 1 to 2 month, pause or exemption, whatever you want to call it. And that's also room for negotiation with China. So I think investors are viewing this as kind of breathing room. You're still not going to see any sort of guidance in terms of, earnings and earnings season. But I think this is definitely a step off the cliff relative to where we were the last week.
Dan, I caught a lot of flack from a lot of my followers on that dark day because, look, I was overseas. I was living my best life, or at least trying to, while this was all unfolding, and I'm paying attention to it at night, and I listened into you guys' interview. And even as you're thinking through your coverage universe right now, how many of those names within your universe are still in this twilight zone? Because that's how you titled your most recent note around Apple as well.
I mean, look, if you assume that these ultimately stay in effect, then you never would be bullish on another tech stock, for the rest of the year. I mean, so our view is that it's going to get negotiated to something much more containable. And that's something that tech companies, auto companies, from Tesla to GM, to basically every tech company in the supply chain is dealing with. But the reality is that the industry spoke, the 10-year spoke, the dollar spoke, and they need to come back. They need to come back to some sort of area that they're going to be able to negotiate in terms of the White House. And I think that's how the market's reading this.
And it sounds like you're reading it like these negotiations will take place for tech. To what degree do you think that there's a Trump put in U.S. tech stocks?
I do think there is. I think ultimately, if you go back to the last 2 weeks, and I told you, look, 25 years doing this, dot-com bubble, financial crisis, COVID, and everything in between. It's the craziest 2 weeks that I've seen in my career. And scariest relative to what it could have done to the U.S. tech sector and still what we're dealing with. But I do believe, the market spoke, an industry leader spoke, and there's no alternative. And now I'm not saying, do you still need some onshoring, reciprocal tariffs at some minimal level? Yeah. But in its current form, it couldn't stay at this pace. And I think that's just the reality of the situation, instead of just behind a microphone in the Beltway. That this is the reality of what the industry is seeing.
Dan, while we have you, we were just speaking with Pras a moment ago just about one of the other names that you cover in Tesla, and how essentially that is going to need to swerve any type of the activity or policy that's coming forth around automakers as well. From your best estimation, does that alleviate enough pressure on Tesla, or is Tesla in a world of its own, especially considering Elon Musk's annexation to the White House?
Yeah, look, when it comes to the tariff issue, they're actually best positioned relative to Detroit Big Three and others, and obviously foreign automakers still impacted, right? And Musk has talked about that in terms of just auto parts, right? And I continue to think the tariff will ultimately, and Pras hit it, I believe will ultimately be finished cars versus auto parts. That'll be a significant difference. I think that's how it ultimately ends up being. Look, when it comes to Tesla, I think the worry is, what does retaliatory look like in China in terms of buy domestic, right? I think that's something that's at play. And they have a pivotal 6 months ahead in terms of, what everything we see in Austin, autonomous, and the build out, but the brand issues that Musk, self-inflicted, is dealing with in terms of demand destruction in Europe and the US. And that's why this is a key few quarters ahead for Tesla and also for Musk to make, in my opinion, the right decisions to take a step back from administration.
And talk to me about Apple, another name that you covered, Dan. Where do you see Apple heading from here? And also want to get a check-in on how you're thinking about iPhone prices amid these carve-outs.
Yeah, so look, they're not going to give guidance, when they report earnings. But I think the view is 10% numbers cuts kind of baked in here. I think that's sort of what I would assume. Let's call it maybe 7-10%, relative to demand destruction, uncertainty. Now, look, if those separate tariffs go in combined with the baseline, you and there were no negotiations, you'd be looking at a $2,000 iPhone, and that's massive demand destruction. And that is the key right here: is that you have to assume as an investor, negotiations get down to some sort of manageable tariff rate over the next, call it 2, 3, 4 months. That's how investors are viewing it relative to Apple. But it's also why we didn't downgrade Apple. We didn't downgrade any tech stock. It's our view, like, this is ultimately something that's going to take place over the next 2, 3, 4 months.
If we're charting this over the past 3 months, as we're looking at this kind of longer term chart that was on the screen a moment ago, Dan, I mean, this is still just a lower high for Apple as they're touching the top end of what that range looks like to the downside. As you're thinking about the technical analysis versus where investors would be apt to buy in and looking at some of the dip buying opportunities that are in the market, where does Apple sit within that?
Yeah, look, and the business model is turned upside down, right? I mean, we're not just talking about things like iPhone demand, AI being pushed. I mean, I truly believe, like, this has now been, what I view is, call it a 10 to 20% overhang in the stock. But you need to see how it plays out for Apple. I believe best case, you start to get back, 250, 260, 270. Worst case, you could go down another 10, 15, 20%, right? I mean, I think as you start to get toward 180, that's where a lot of investors look like it's like table pounder time. But the reality is that you need to understand the rules of the game, what the tariff issues are going to be and what you're dealing with and what numbers ultimately look like, especially with 2026.
All right, Dan, we got to leave it there. Always appreciate your insights. Thank you so much.